"Open it," Richard Carter said, and the whole room went quiet enough to hear the lock breathe. At the center of Carter Estate's glass-walled library, beneath a chandelier worth more than most homes in Ohio, Madison Blake stood in front of Emily Whitmore's private safe with a brass key shining between her fingers. She wore the kind of smile people practiced in mirrors, soft at the edges, sharp underneath. Around her, donors, bankers, board members, and society wives held their champagne glasses still, waiting for a scandal to unfold like entertainment. Richard stood beside Madison in a black tuxedo, one hand in his pocket, his wedding ring already gone, his confidence polished brighter than the marble floor. He had invited Emily to the gala as a courtesy, or so the card had said. A charity dinner, a public celebration, a fresh start for Carter Group. But Emily knew the moment she walked through the iron gates that the evening had been staged for something else. She stood 10 feet away from the safe, wearing an ivory dress with long sleeves and no jewelry except a pair of pearl earrings her mother had left her. She looked calm, almost too calm, as if the room were cold water and she had learned how not to shiver. Madison lifted the key for everyone to see. "A woman with nothing to hide," she said, turning her voice toward the crowd, "shouldn't be afraid of a little honesty." A few people laughed, not because it was funny, but because money had taught them where to place their loyalty. Richard did not look at Emily when Madison slid the key into the lock. That was the first thing Emily noticed. He watched the guests instead, measuring their faces, making sure they saw him as the wounded husband and not the man who had handed another woman the key to his wife's private property. The safe clicked once. Then again. The sound moved through the room like a blade of ice. Emily did not step forward. She did not raise her voice. She did not beg him to stop. She only lowered her gaze to Madison's hand as it touched the handle, then lifted her eyes to the small black camera hidden high in the bookshelf, barely larger than a dime. Daniel Mercer had told her not to look at it. Too long. 1 second was enough. Madison pulled the heavy door open, and a soft metallic groan filled the library. Inside sat a black velvet box, 3 sealed envelopes, and a silver flash drive resting on top of a folded note. Madison's smile widened. She reached in like someone picking up a trophy. "Let's see what the perfect wife was hiding," she said. Emily finally spoke, her voice low enough that the front row had to lean closer. "Did he tell you what happens after you touch what isn't yours?" Madison froze for half a second, then laughed as if the question had no weight. But Richard's jaw tightened. Across the room, an older man in a charcoal suit closed his watch with a quiet snap. And for the first time that night, Emily allowed herself the smallest smile, because Madison had just opened the one door Richard could never close again. The silence after Emily's question did not last long, because Richard had built the evening to swallow silence before it could become doubt. He stepped forward with the careful sadness of a man who had rehearsed his disappointment in private. "Emily," he said, letting her name drift across the room. Nobody wanted it to come to this. The words were gentle, but his eyes were measuring the crowd again, counting sympathy like stock options. Behind him, the wide windows of Carter Estate reflected a room full of polished shoes, diamond bracelets, and people who loved a scandal as long as it did not cost them anything. This was not just a charity gala. It was the night Richard planned to announce a $200 million investment round for Carter Group, the kind of deal that could push his company from regional power to national empire. 3 television cameras waited in the ballroom. A row of investors from New York stood near the fireplace. A senator's wife had already posed beside the donation wall. Every flower, every speech, every glass of champagne had been arranged to make Richard look untouchable. Emily had been invited because her absence would raise questions. Her presence would be easier to control. Earlier that evening, before the guests arrived, Richard had asked her to meet him in the small study off the library. There had been no music there, no laughter, only the smell of leather chairs and expensive cologne. On the desk sat a folder with her name printed on it in black ink. He had pushed it toward her with 2 fingers and said it was only paperwork, a clean ending, nothing personal. Emily opened it and saw exactly what he wanted. Her signature would release any future claim to the early financial models that had saved Carter Group 5 years ago. It would erase the unpaid loan from the Whitmore Family Trust. It would confirm that Richard alone owned the strategy, the projections, the investor lists, even the software framework she had built at their kitchen table in a rented townhouse outside Boston. He wanted her to surrender the bones of the company so he could sell the body without a scar. Emily had read every page while Richard watched her face. He expected tears, maybe anger, maybe the tired surrender of a woman who had spent too many years being told that peace was worth any price. Instead, she closed the folder, placed the pen beside it, and said, "No." That one word changed the night. Richard's mouth tightened, not from surprise, but from insult. He had mistaken her quiet for weakness for so long that her refusal sounded to him like betrayal. Madison had been waiting outside the study, pretending to admire a painting. She saw the unsigned papers in Richard's hand. She saw his pride crack behind his smile. And when he whispered something to her near the hallway mirror, Emily understood that the private pressure had failed, so the public punishment would begin. Now, in the library, Madison held the silver drive between two manicured fingers as if she had found a smoking secret. Richard turned toward the guests and said, "For years, I protected my wife from questions. Tonight, I think everyone deserves the truth." Emily looked at the folder still resting on the study desk through the half-open door. Then she looked back at him, calm as winter glass. He thought he had moved the battle into a brighter room. He did not realize Emily had only refused to sign because she wanted witnesses. Madison lifted the silver drive higher, and the chandelier scattered light across its polished surface like a tiny trophy. "This," she said, turning slowly so every guest could see it, was hidden inside Emily's private safe. After everything Richard gave her, after the house, the name, the life, she still kept secrets. A murmur moved through the library, soft at first, then warmer, like a match finding dry paper. Emily felt it pass over her skin without entering her. She had heard rooms turn before. Boardrooms, dining rooms, court-adjacent hallways where people lowered their voices when she walked by. The wealthy rarely shouted when they condemned someone. They only looked away at the same time. Madison opened one of the sealed envelopes and pulled out a stack of printed pages. She did not notice the tiny red mark in the lower corner of each sheet, the one Daniel Mercer had placed there himself. She did not notice the difference between original documents and protected copies. She only saw paper, and because Richard had told her it would ruin Emily, she believed him. Bank transfers, Madison announced. Private accounts. Financial records she never disclosed. Richard took 2 steps closer to the investors by the fireplace, careful to leave Madison in front of the open safe, careful to let her hands do the touching and her voice do the accusing. Emily watched that too. The distance between them was not emotional. It was strategic. Richard had always been good at standing near the fire without letting smoke cling to his suit. "Emily," he said, soft enough to sound wounded, loud enough to be useful. "Why would you hide these from the company?" There it was, the question designed like a hallway with only one exit. If she defended herself, she would sound desperate. If she accused him, she would sound bitter. If she cried, they would call it guilt. So Emily did what Daniel had told her to do in the office with rain running down the windows and legal pads spread across the table. She let the lie grow legs. She let it walk in public. She looked at Madison's fingers on the envelope, at Richard's nod toward the internal counsel near the bar, at the senator's wife whispering behind a white rose centerpiece. Then her eyes moved for one, clean second to the bookcase above Madison's shoulder. The camera lens sat between 2 first editions, dark and steady. Below it, tucked beneath a crystal vase of orchids, a small recording device captured every word in the room. Daniel Mercer stood near the back wall, gray hair neat, charcoal suit still, one hand resting on the silver watch he had closed moments earlier. He did not look like a man waiting to save anyone. He looked like a man waiting for a clock to reach the hour he had chosen. Madison reached for the black velvet box next. "And what do we have here?" she asked, smiling toward Richard as if asking permission to enjoy herself. Richard gave the smallest nod. Emily saw it. So did the camera. Madison opened the box, expecting jewelry, maybe something sentimental she could twist into shame. Inside was a folded card on thick white paper and a second seal, deep blue, pressed with the Whitmore family crest. Madison's smile flickered, but pride pushed her forward. She unfolded the card and read the first line under her breath before deciding not to read it aloud. For the first time that night, her hand hesitated. Richard noticed. "Well?" he asked, irritation cutting through his practiced sorrow. Emily placed her empty champagne glass on the nearest table with a soft click. The sound was small, but half the room turned toward her. She had not raised her voice, but her stillness had begun to feel louder than Madison's performance. "Go on," Emily said quietly. "You wanted everyone to see." Madison swallowed, then looked back into the open safe. The silver drive, the marked papers, the sealed note, the velvet box, every item sat exactly where Emily and Daniel had placed them. Not to hide the truth, to make sure the right hands touched it first. And as Richard stepped closer to urge Madison on, Emily saw the final piece fall into place. He was no longer beside the scandal. He was inside it. 3 years before that night, before the chandeliers and the cameras and the room full of people waiting to judge her, Emily Whitmore had sat barefoot at a kitchen table in a rented townhouse outside Boston with a dying laptop, a stack of bank notices, and Richard Carter asleep on the couch behind her. Carter Group had not been an empire then. It was a failing real estate company with 2 unfinished developments, angry lenders, and less than $7,000 in its operating account. Richard had charisma, expensive suits he could barely afford, and a talent for making people believe tomorrow would be brighter if they gave him one more chance. Emily was the one who made tomorrow possible. She built the financial model line by line while rain tapped against the windows and the coffee turned cold beside her. She called banks before sunrise. She rewrote investor proposals after midnight. She sold the lake house her mother had left her and moved the money through the Whitmore family trust to keep Richard from losing everything. When he panicked, she steadied him. When he doubted himself, she handed him the numbers. When lenders said no, she found the one clause that made them listen again. Richard used to stand behind her chair, kiss the top of her head, and whisper that one day the world would know she was the reason he survived. But success has a quiet way of changing the shape of gratitude. The first time Carter Group appeared in a business magazine, Emily's name was not in the article. Richard told her it was an oversight. The second time, he said investors preferred a simple founder story. By the third interview, he had learned to say, "I built this company from nothing," without blinking. Emily noticed the small erasures first. Her access to certain files expired. Her seat at planning meetings was given to a new communications consultant named Madison Blake. Emails she had written were forwarded under Richard's name. A software framework she had designed for risk forecasting appeared in a board presentation with the Carter Group logo covering the corner where her initials used to be. She asked him about it one night while they stood in their new kitchen, the one with white marble counters and windows facing the Charles River. Richard poured himself sparkling water and told her she was being sensitive. Madison was talented, he said. The company needed a fresher face, he said. Emily had done enough, he said, as if enough was a polite word for disappearing. After that, she stopped arguing and started saving copies. Not because she wanted a fight, but because something in her had gone very still. She printed agreements and placed them in labeled folders. She backed up emails to a private drive. She kept records of transfers from the Whitmore Trust, board notes with her comments, early projections with timestamps, and every message where Richard asked her to fix a problem he later claimed to have solved alone. When the divorce papers arrived 18 months later, Richard expected her to break. Instead, Emily signed only what was fair and refused everything that erased her. He mistook that refusal for bitterness. He did not know that by then. Emily had already learned the difference between love and evidence. Love asks to be remembered. Evidence makes forgetting expensive. The morning after the divorce became public, Emily Whitmore woke before sunrise in a one-bedroom apartment on Beacon Street, with 3 cardboard boxes stacked beside the door and the city still blue beyond the windows. There was no marble kitchen, no staff moving quietly through hallways, no driver waiting outside. Just the hum of the refrigerator, the smell of dark coffee, and the paper cut on her thumb from sorting through 5 years of a marriage Richard had tried to turn into a footnote. She wore an old gray sweater, tied her hair back, and carried the boxes herself down 2 flights of stairs because the elevator in the building had been broken for a week. By 8 o'clock, she was standing inside the law office of Daniel Mercer, a narrow brownstone near Commonwealth Avenue where the floors creaked softly and every shelf looked like it had witnessed someone's life change. Daniel had known her father. He had handled the Whitmore family trust before Richard ever learned how to pronounce venture capital without sounding impressed by himself. He did not greet Emily with pity. He did not tell her she was strong. He simply took the first folder from her hands, opened it, and began to read. Hours passed in the slow language of paper. Coffee cooled in white cups. Rain marked the tall windows. Daniel turned pages, compared dates, circled signatures, and placed colored tabs along the edges with the patience of a surgeon and the manners of a banker. Emily sat across from him, hands folded, watching her past become organized into evidence. The wire transfers from the Whitmore Trust. The early projections with her initials in the file metadata. The emails where Richard wrote, "Please fix this before the lender call." The drafts of the risk model created months before Carter Group claimed it had been developed internally. The board notes that mentioned Emily by name before someone later removed her from the official summary. Daniel read until the office lights came on by themselves. Then he took off his glasses, placed them beside the documents, and looked at her for the first time as if he finally saw the shape of the whole room Richard had built around her. "Do not chase a liar down the street," he said. "Let him choose a microphone." Emily did not answer, but the sentence entered her like a key turning. Daniel explained that Richard had done what careless men often did after success, made them feel untouchable. He had taken too much, erased too loudly, and trusted that Emily's dignity would keep her quiet. That was his mistake. Dignity was not silence. Dignity was discipline. Daniel told her not to post, not to argue, not to defend herself at cocktail parties where people came for gossip and left with half-truths. "When they lie in private, it becomes your word against theirs," he said. "When they lie in front of witnesses, it becomes a record." That was when the plan began. Not with revenge, but with restraint. Emily would keep every original protected. She would let Richard believe she had retreated. She would allow Madison to mistake elegance for fear. And if they ever crossed the line from rumor into action, if they ever touched what was legally hers, Daniel would be ready. Months later, when the invitation to Carter Estate arrived on thick cream paper, Emily called him without saying hello. Daniel listened as rain tapped against her apartment window, the same sound from that first day. Then he said, "Bring the ivory dress. I will bring the trap." The first time Nathaniel Hayes saw Emily Whitmore's work, he did not know her face. He saw her name buried in the metadata of an old financial model Carter Group had submitted during a preliminary investment review. 3 quiet initials left behind, like a fingerprint no one had thought to wipe clean. Nathaniel was not the kind of man impressed by polished pitch decks or champagne promises. He had built Hayes Capital by reading what other people missed, and what he saw inside that model was not ordinary. The projections were disciplined. The risk layers were elegant. The debt structure had been built by someone who understood pressure, not someone who merely sold confidence in a tailored suit. 3 days later, he asked his analysts who had designed it. They came back with Richard Carter's public biography, a magazine profile, and a sentence that made Nathaniel close the folder slowly. Founder and sole architect of Carter Group's expansion strategy. Nathaniel knew a borrowed mind when he saw one. 2 weeks before the gala, Emily met him in a private conference room 30 floors above downtown Boston, where the windows looked out over the harbor and the table was bare except for 2 cups of black coffee and a stack of documents Daniel Mercer had already reviewed. Nathaniel did not offer sympathy. He did not speak about betrayal as if it were a tragic decoration. He opened the model, pointed to a sequence of formulas, and said, "This was not written by your ex-husband." Emily looked at the screen for a long moment. "No," she said. "It was written at my kitchen table." That was the beginning of the second trap, the one Richard could not see because he was too busy admiring the first stage he had built for himself. Carter Group was not simply hosting a charity gala. Richard was using the gala to close a $200 million investment round, and Hayes Capital was the silent force behind the largest piece of it. Richard believed Nathaniel wanted access to his developments, his projections, his public image. He did not understand that Nathaniel was studying ownership, authorship, and liability. He did not understand that the value he was trying to sell belonged partly to the woman he had invited only to humiliate. Nathaniel gave Emily a choice, not a rescue. He would pause the investment if her claims were supported. He would bring independent witnesses. He would make sure no one inside Carter Group could bury the evidence before morning. But he would not speak for her unless she asked him to. Emily appreciated that more than any grand promise. Men had spoken over her for years, some in anger, some in praise. both taking space that belonged to her. Nathaniel simply stood where truth needed room. On the afternoon of the gala, Daniel Mercer delivered the final protected copies to Carter Estate under the name of a routine legal inventory. The silver drive was marked. The envelopes were marked. The velvet box held a card written for the first unauthorized hand that opened it. The camera in the library had been checked from 2 angles. The recording device beneath the orchids had fresh batteries. The safe itself remained legally tied to Emily's separate property, a detail Richard had ignored because arrogance rarely reads paperwork carefully. Before leaving her apartment, Emily fastened her pearl earrings and smoothed the sleeves of the ivory dress. Her phone lit up with a message from Nathaniel. "I will be there before the announcement." She turned the screen face down, picked up her coat, and stepped into the evening without hurry. She was not going back to Carter Estate to be believed. She was going back to let them be recorded. Back inside the library of Carter Estate, the past folded itself quietly behind Emily as Madison held the silver drive like proof of victory. The guests had leaned closer without realizing it. Champagne glasses hovered near painted lips. A board member from New York adjusted his cuff links twice, his eyes fixed on the open safe. Richard stood just far enough from Madison to look innocent, and just close enough to control the story. "Go ahead," he said, his voice low but carrying through the room. "Show them what she kept from us." Madison loved the word us. It made her feel chosen, permanent, already seated in the place Emily had left behind. She turned the silver drive between her fingers, then reached for the folded card inside the velvet box. The card was thick, white, and calm in a way that irritated her. It did not look like guilt. It looked prepared. For a second, Madison's smile trembled at the edges, but the crowd was watching, and pride does not know how to step backward gracefully. She unfolded it again and forced a laugh. "This is dramatic," she said. "A little message from the former Mrs. Carter." Emily did not correct the title. She simply watched Madison choose the trap with both hands. Madison cleared her throat and skipped the first line, the line that had made her hesitate. Instead, she waved the card in the air and said, "Clearly, Emily expected someone to find this someday. That sounds like someone hiding something to me." Richard nodded at once. "Exactly." That single word landed cleanly beneath the camera lens. Daniel Mercer, still near the back wall, lowered his hand from his watch and looked toward the orchids. The recording device listened without blinking. Madison moved to the sealed envelopes next. She tore one open, ignoring the blue legal seal across the flap, and pulled out printed bank records marked in the corner with a small red identification stamp. She saw numbers, names, transfer dates, and the Whitmore Trust. She did not see the pattern. She did not see that every page was a copy, every copy was numbered, and every number matched a master file already sitting in Daniel's briefcase. "Here," she announced. Money moved through her family trust. Private accounts. Hidden transfers. This is why she refused to sign tonight. A few guests whispered again. Richard took the opening immediately. "I tried to settle this with dignity," he said. "I tried to protect her reputation." Emily finally looked at him, and the room seemed to narrow around that look. He had said the word dignity as if it belonged to him, as if he had not built an entire evening to strip it from her in public. Madison, encouraged by the murmurs, reached deeper into the safe and lifted the last envelope. This one was heavier. Across the front, in Daniel Mercer's precise handwriting, were 3 words Madison should have stopped to understand. Protected legal inventory. She ripped it. Open anyway. Inside was a printed email chain, the first page showing Richard's name, Madison's name, and a sentence in black ink that made her breath catch. "Tonight, we make Emily look guilty." The words hung in her eyes before she could hide them. Richard saw the change in her face and moved toward her too quickly. "Give that to me," he said. But Madison had already held it high enough for the guests in front to read. A woman near the fireplace gasped. The New York investor stopped adjusting his cuff links. Emily remained still, her hands resting at her sides, her ivory sleeves untouched by the chaos rising around her. Madison lowered the paper, her fingers suddenly uncertain. "Richard," she whispered, but the microphone beneath the orchids caught every syllable. Across the room, the tall double doors opened with a soft click. Nathaniel Hayes stepped in first, silent in a dark suit, followed by 2 investment attorneys and Daniel Mercer's assistant carrying a slim black case. Richard turned. And for the first time that night, he looked less like a man hosting a gala and more like a man hearing a lock close from the wrong side. Daniel Mercer did not rush toward the safe. He walked through the library as if the room had already confessed, and he was only there to collect the signature. The whispers fell away one by one. Madison stood frozen with the email page in her hand, the silver drive still resting on the edge of the open safe, her confidence draining so quickly that even her smile seemed to lose its shape. Richard looked at Nathaniel Hayes, then at the two investment attorneys behind him, and something in his face changed. For years, Richard had known how to manage a room. He knew when to laugh, when to lower his voice, when to make betrayal sound like business. But this room had stopped belonging to him the moment Madison touched the safe. Daniel reached the center table, placed his leather briefcase beside the white roses, and opened it with a soft click. "Thank you, Miss Blake," he said, his voice calm enough to feel colder than anger. "That was the final confirmation we needed." Madison blinked. Confirmation of what? Daniel turned slightly, not to her, but to the guests. Unauthorized access to separate property, witnessed by 42 guests, recorded by security equipment already disclosed in the estate inventory, and performed after Mr. Carter was seen providing the key. Richard stepped forward. "This is absurd. That safe is in my house." Emily's eyes moved to him, quiet and clear. Daniel removed a document from the briefcase and laid it on the table. "The house is held by Carter Estate Holdings. The safe, its contents, and the legal archive inside it remain the separate property of Emily Whitmore, registered after the divorce filing and acknowledged by your counsel 6 months ago." The internal counsel near the bar lowered his gaze. Richard saw it and went pale around the mouth. Daniel's assistant opened the slim black case and connected a small device to the library screen. The wall where Richard had planned to show a tribute video for his donors lit up with documents instead. First came the safe inventory, then the transfer logs from the Whitmore Trust, then the early financial model with Emily's initials in the original file data, then an email from Richard to Madison, sent 2 days before the gala. "Tonight, we make Emily look guilty." No one spoke. Even the ice in the glasses seemed to settle more quietly. Madison shook her head, but the screen moved on without mercy. There were messages instructing her where the key would be placed. A draft statement Richard planned to release after the gala. A note to his public relations team calling Emily unstable, greedy, and legally cornered. Nathaniel stood near the doorway, hands folded in front of him, his expression unreadable. Only when Daniel displayed the investment documents did he step forward. Hayes Capital entered this evening prepared to finalize a $200 million investment review, Nathaniel said. Given the evidence of disputed ownership, misrepresentation, and potential fraud in the materials submitted to us, we are suspending all participation immediately. The words struck Richard harder than any accusation because they were not emotional. They were financial. The empire he had dressed in flowers and champagne began to dim under the library lights. Madison placed the email page on the table as if setting down something fragile. "Richard told me she was hiding things," she whispered. Daniel looked at her, not unkindly, but without rescue. She was preserving them. Then he turned to Emily. For the first time all night, the room followed his gaze to the woman they had been invited to judge. Emily did not move toward Richard. She did not explain herself to Madison. She only reached into the safe, picked up the final sealed envelope that no unauthorized hand had opened, and placed it in Daniel Mercer's waiting palm. Emily placed the final envelope into Daniel Mercer's hand, and the room understood that the real ending had never been inside the safe. It had been waiting for the moment Richard could no longer pretend he was only a disappointed husband. Daniel broke the seal, removed a single document, and laid it beneath the library lights. It was not a confession. It was not a speech. It was the original ownership schedule for Carter Group's expansion model, the Whitmore Trust loan agreement, and the amendment Richard had refused to disclose during the investment review. Emily's name sat on the page in black ink, clean and unshaken, where Richard had spent years trying to erase it. The guests who had whispered earlier now stood very still, as if shame had entered the room and chosen every face one by one. Madison stepped back from the safe, her hands empty at last. Richard stared at the document as though the paper itself had betrayed him. "Emily," he said, and for the first time that night, Her name did not sound like an accusation. It sounded like a plea. She looked at him without anger. That was what frightened him most. There was no door in her face left open for him to walk through. Nathaniel Hayes spoke quietly with the investment attorneys near the doorway, and within minutes, the announcement Richard had planned for the ballroom was canceled. No champagne toast. No glowing tribute video. No $200 million celebration under the cameras. Outside, black cars lined the curved driveway, their headlights shining through the rain like pale ribbons across the wet stone. Inside, Daniel gathered the documents while his assistant secured the recordings. The senator's wife left without saying goodbye. The New York investors followed. Board members who had laughed at Richard's jokes all evening suddenly remembered urgent phone calls. An empire built on borrowed brilliance did not collapse loudly. It simply lost the room. Richard moved toward Emily, slower now, stripped of audience and certainty. "I was trying to protect the company," he said. Emily picked up the brass key Madison had used and placed it on the table beside her old wedding ring, the one she had carried for months on a thin chain in her pocket, not because she missed him, but because some endings need a place to land. "No," she said softly. "You were trying to own what you never honored." She turned away before he could answer. Nathaniel opened the library doors, but he did not touch her, did not guide her, did not claim the moment as his. He only made space. Emily walked past the chandelier, past the empty champagne glasses, past the portrait Richard had once hung of himself in the hallway, and out into the rain-covered night. The air smelled like wet cedar and gasoline, cold enough to wake the skin. Behind her, Carter Estate glowed with all its windows, bright and hollow. Daniel stepped beside her under the portico and handed her a copy of the filing. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "your name goes back where it belongs." Emily looked down at the page, then at the driveway stretching beyond the iron gates. For years, she had thought justice would feel like thunder. Instead, it felt like quiet breathing after a door finally closed. Nathaniel's car waited at the curb, but Emily took one more second before stepping forward. She was not leaving as Richard Carter's ex-wife. She was leaving as Emily Whitmore, the woman who had stopped begging to be remembered and made the truth impossible to ignore. She did not win him back. She won herself.